welcome to today's webinar. I'm Rebecca Winkelmann and Managing Director of WHU's Executive Education Activities, and it is my pleasure to announce and welcome our speaker for today, Michael Frenkel, Professor of Macroeconomics and International Economics at WHU Otto Beisheim School of Management. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Before I hand over to you, Michael, let me quickly do a couple of housekeeping announcements for our participants. For those of you who have joined us before, this may be repetitive, but for those ones who have joined for the first time, you may have noticed that your cameras are switched off and that your microphones are muted by default and that they cannot be unmuted. This is due to the fact that we are expecting a large audience today and we want to ensure the quality of this webinar. Nevertheless, we would like to ask you and encourage you to interact with us. If you take a look at the lower menu bar in your Zoom, you see a little icon that says Q&A, or for those ones who are using the German version of Zoom, F&A. If you click on that icon, a new window opens and you can actually put down your questions to Professor Frenkel into that window. Because Professor Frenkel has structured this webinar in the following way. He will first give a presentation and then has dedicated some time to answer your questions. In case you would like to get in touch with our support team in case of technical issues or comments, or if you have any other questions that are non-content related, please make use of the chat, which you can also find on your lower menu bar in Zoom. One final remark, this webinar will be recorded and the recording will be made available to all of you once we close this webinar. And with having said that, Michael, I'm handing over to you.
Thank you very much, Rebecca, and thank you for welcoming me here and inviting me to the webinar. It's a great pleasure to talk here about an economic topic that's very close to my heart, and I've done a little bit of research on this lately. Yes, for all of those who are watching this now, I also would like to welcome all of you in this forum that is particular to the COVID-19 crisis. I'm sitting here in my office at WHU, or as we say, WHU. And so you basically have a look into my office that typically students don't have, because they see the faculty in the classroom or in the hallway. So out of my office here, I do this webinar. And as you see, I want to talk about the slump of the German economy that results, or that is expected to result from the COVID-19 pandemic. How big will this be? And hence my focus is on Germany. However, I will make some remarks on global developments. And if you have questions later that are more related to global developments, I'm happy to answer those too. So let us get started. I think we can say that the COVID-19 pandemic is a triple crisis. The triple crisis basically consists of a medical crisis, a social crisis, and an economic crisis. Currently, the medical crisis is in the forefront of the attention. So you hear in all news, kind of on a daily basis, about new cases, recoveries, death rates, and the R values, and so on. And therefore, the attention is in the medical crisis. However, I think the medical crisis will be the very first one we will overcome, whenever that will be. And this will be one thing that I basically use as a hypothesis in the following analysis. But before I get to this, let me also address the other crises a little bit. The economic crisis, that's what we hear now more and more. This is unemployment, these are the shutdowns, these are the consumption opportunities that we don't have. We can't go to a theater, we can't go to restaurants, they are gradually opening up now, and so on. And the social crisis is probably the one that will last perhaps the longest. And that depends certainly on the length of the economic crisis. And what we mean when we talk about social crisis, we mean the behavior of people, the behavior and their attitudes, their thinking about politics, and so on. So I think there's this hierarchy. First, we see the medical crisis, then the social and economic crisis, depending on the areas. We see perhaps first the economic and then the social crisis. Sometimes people are upset about the restriction and we see the social crisis before. However, my focus is on the economic crisis. And here is the hypothesis that I want to use, namely the hypothesis that the end of the medical crisis is the prerequisite for the end of the economic crisis. And thereafter, the length of the economic crisis is probably limited. But again, the prerequisite is that the medical crisis is over. So what are the effects on the economy? Because this is, we could say, a manifold effect. So let's look at how economists typically think about the market. And you know, when you think about economics, you often think about supply and demand. And this is no different here. Let us look at the market as a whole. So assume that we don't have specific effects on individual markets, but that we look at what you see in this right diagram, aggregate demand curve, of course, with a negative slope, and aggregate supply curve with a positive slope. The black curves are the curves prevailing before the crisis happens. And so we say there's an equilibrium in E0 with production or output at Q0. And now we will have the effects of the pandemic. And the effects are twofold. And that's a new thing. Namely, we first have an effect on aggregate supply, the shutdown, the disruption of supply chains, partly decreasing labor supply because people are in quarantine, and insolvencies. So companies drop out of the market. And so that shifts the supply curve to the left. And a subsequent effect, more or less happening then pretty close to when the supply curve shifts, is what we call a negative demand shock, namely a shift of the demand curve to the left. Why? Because people have lower income, they lose their jobs, there's higher unemployment, people can't consume certain products or services, there's social distancing, so some of this cannot be done, you cannot party at home, and so on. And of course, those who derive income from profits, they have lower income. And then there is an effect that must not be underestimated, the uncertainty. Uncertainty typically leads to holding back. People refrain from consumption and think especially about durable consumer goods. And we see this in a number of areas right now. Probably an area that everybody can relate to is the car industry. So car manufacturers see that people hesitate to buy a car now. So the consequence of a leftward shift of the demand and leftward shift of the supply is a strong inflation, a strong recession. Inflation, we don't know, as a matter of fact. That will be a very tricky question. I do not think that currently we have a risk of high inflation because I think the demand shock is quite significant. But you could basically shift these curves in this diagram to a different extent, and then you get some price effects too. So where in the complexity of the economy does the virus occur? Here is a diagram that typically we use in national income accounting. We see three sectors of the domestic economy. We classify typically them into private households, the public sector, and companies. Now the easiest way, because it looks relatively complicated, is companies produce something. And they produce something using labor of private households. And they pay them wages. The arrows indicate in which direction money flows, you could say. So the financial flows. So they pay wages to private households, and the private households use these wages to consume, buy consumer products. And to the extent that they don't use income for consumption, they save. So that goes to the financial sector. And the financial sector use this to finance the demand of companies, for example, for investment purposes. And then there's the public sector. Companies have to pay taxes to the public sector, and they get subsidies or the government purchases goods from them. And likewise, the private sector, so private households, they have to pay taxes to the public sector, and the public sector pays all kinds of transfers to the private households. And then we have, of course, the rest of the world. Companies export to the rest of the world, so financial flows go to companies from the rest of the world, and likewise the other way around, imports. So now you see all these viruses here, the signs and the red numbers. That is the effect of the virus or the pandemic in this kind of circular flow of money. Interrupted supply chains on the import side, of course, and the export side. Import side, because some countries cannot deliver because their production is shut down. And on the export side, the same thing. Companies in the country, so in Germany, have to shut down. They cannot deliver to the rest of the world. When private households have low income and less wealth, they consume less. And maybe they can't service their debt. So then the financial sector gets a bad loan portfolio. And so in that sense, the financial sector is affected. Could that lead to a banking crisis, many people ask. At the moment, doesn't look like, but who knows? And then, of course, companies have lower demand on financial services of banks because their investments are subject to more uncertainty and they hold back. And so there's a decline in investment projects. Companies buying from each other also see a disruption of the supply chain. Some of the companies drop out because of the lack of demand, lack of cash flows. So in other words, insolvencies, and they may not be replaced right away by other companies. So in that sense, a number of points in the economy where the pandemic can affect the financial flows. So what does that mean? This means the economic effects will be widespread. It will affect small, medium, and large companies. The size is of a second order here. Some companies are, of course, more affected than others, but basically it's across the board where these effects show up. And it is the biggest crisis since 90 years, the global recession. It is much bigger, as we will see, than the global financial crisis that we had in 2008 and 9. Never before in the past 100 years, I basically say 100 years, although exactly 90 years, have we had the following: a nearly standstill in a number of areas in the economy. This is unprecedented. Germans who live now have never seen this in this country. And then there's a travel warning by the Federal Ministry for Foreign Affairs. And this is typically for areas like Afghanistan, Sudan, and Syria, but now for the entire world. And many basically look at this to design their travel plans. And in addition, you cannot travel right now. So this is, especially for Germans who travel a lot across the world, a very tight or very strict regulation that restricts their freedom. Now, different sectors are hit to a different degree. Most of the sectors are hit very hard, very badly hit. Companies that had basically to completely shut down, or companies that are not allowed to produce certain parts, or where demand broke down significantly. Examples: airlines, hospitality, restaurants, hair salons, professional sports, fairs, cultural events, and entertainment, oil and gas, because of lower demand, automotive industry, durable consumer goods in general. An area that is mildly hit so far is construction. And we have some areas that have positive effects, that realize positive effects. You can all see them: the supermarkets, producer of food, hygienic products, drugstores, and distribution centers. You all remember the hype about toilet paper. That's fortunately over. But you can see that this is an area where companies make very good business by the pure fact that you don't see any bargains right now, any sales. Have you realized that there are no such sales right now going on? So that's an interesting phenomenon where we all can see that this sector must do well. But this is only a small sector in the in the economy. So what will be the effects in 2020 and 21? Now, recently, a few institutions in Germany and an international institution that's very often seen as kind of the trendsetter, the IMF, issued first projections. The Council of Economic Experts, end of March, developed 3 scenarios. In the best scenario, the GDP would go down by 3.1%, in the worst by 5.5%. The Joint Economic Forecast Project Group, these are forecasts of the 5 big macroeconomic project institutions or research institutions, and projected 4.2, a decline of 4.2. The IMF says 7.0, for Europe as a whole, 7.5. And just last week, 2 weeks ago, the Federal Ministry of Economic Affairs and Energy issued a projection of 6.3. 6.3. All of these projections say that recovery in 2021 will be fast. So these projections, I think, for Germany appear more optimistic than the projections we see when we listen to the virologists or the medical doctors, because they draw a much less optimistic picture. They draw a much less optimistic picture about what's happening in the medical area. The end of the medical crisis is not yet in sight. We all hear that the research is very intense on medication against COVID-19 and for the vaccine, but so far we haven't seen any concrete results. Most experts say maybe end of this year, but more slightly early, mid, or even end of 2021. So in the following, I want to apply the hypothesis that the end of the medical crisis precedes the end of the economic crisis for the forecasts. And then we'll see that the forecasts that I just presented appear very optimistic, and I think over-optimistic. So recall that the shutdown led to a significant decline in production. In many areas, complete shutdown. And then a shutdown or a decline in the aggregate demand, some areas, no demand anymore. So what does this imply for growth in Germany? And what I want to present to you are estimates that Heiko Stephan, a young researcher here at WHO, and I done over look at the factors that determine how big will the slump be. And the extent of the recession will depend on 3 factors. So 3 factors will be decisive for the end result. And I want to show you that and discuss with you a little bit the 3 factors. And then you basically can draw scenarios. You can say, oh, I think this is the case for factor 1, for factor 2, and for factor 3. So factor 1 will be the extent to which production goes down during the shutdown. And believe it or not, we have no data on this. We have anecdotal evidence. We have a few surveys that the IFO Institute in Munich ran, but we have no data. We don't know. So we can say, well, the restaurants were empty. The fitness studios were empty. The haircutters just opened up and they may have very good business now. The car manufacturers had to shut down completely, and so on. So this is very, very difficult to estimate. And I will show you how one can do this, and then we include this in our estimate. The second is, how long will the length of the shutdown last? That determines the extent to which we have a recession in 2020. So, and the third one, how long does it take to go back to the old level or structures of the economy? And I have to emphasize what's here just in parentheses, if at all. So for simplicity, we assume in our estimates that it will go back. But I can tell you, the longer the recession will be, the less likely it is that we go back to the old structures. So let me look at the 3 factors one at a time. Factor 1, the extent to which production goes down during the shutdown. So difficult to quantify. I said estimates differ between countries, and even those who dare to do some estimates for Germany come out with different results. So they say between 10% and 35% is the decline in production. We look at this in a moment in more detail. So the second factor is the length of the shutdown. What does this mean? We mean the time between the beginning and the significant easing, not kind of when the first shop can open again. A significant easing, significant meaning for the economy as a whole. So different countries go different ways, and we see the discussion even between different parts of our country, Germany. But we say beginning was mid-March, roundabout mid-March, and the end is probably sometimes in the second quarter. Could be April for some, we don't know yet. It was April for some, it could be May, June, whatever. So, and the third factor is what is the length of the time it takes to go back, if it happens at all. And this will depend on several factors. First one that I mentioned here, not all companies can immediately produce at the pre-corona level. Supply chains are disrupted. You shut down the company, so it takes time to basically get things going again. Then there's a decline in demand, so you don't produce at full capacity. And then again, uncertainties. We can come back to this later. Insolvency. Some companies do not exist anymore then when the economy tries to go back, and other companies may not fill that gap right away. The third one is longer lasting government restriction. Think of professional sports. There will be no soccer stadium filled probably to the extent we saw this even 3 months ago this year anymore. Probably. I wish it were. As a soccer fan, I wish this were the case, but this will not be the case. So it will also depend then, as I said at the beginning, the length of the medical crisis. So we talk about the vaccine. It has to be developed, it has to be tested. The testing takes the longest time and has to be produced and has to be applied. So where are we in the medical crisis? And I'm not a medical doctor, so I can just report what I see to motivate the further discussions. This is here a diagram from the London Business School. They talked about this. This is kind of the theoretical contagion curve. So it looks like the normal distribution. So first goes up and then goes down. So, and we all hear about the flattening of the curve to stretch this a little bit. So what is the empirical evidence? And I want to show you 3 slides on the empirical evidence, namely countries that seem to just get better, some countries that do quite well, and some countries where hope is still far on the horizon. So these are countries where I would say the empirical contagion curve shows serious cases, but hope inside. You see in the upper left corner, Italy, in the lower left, Spain, here, France, and here, the particular case, Sweden. You could talk long about Sweden. You know, that's a particular case as the way they approach it. But these 3 countries are countries that seem to be kind of over the peak. France leveling off, but Italy and Spain, fortunately, on a decline. And you see the numbers of active cases here at the peak were approximately the same. Not in Sweden, that's a much smaller country, but here. And Spain, of course, is more serious because the population is much lower than in Italy and France. So countries that are doing much better are more successful cases in the sense of kind of where are we, are Austria and Switzerland, see this here, South Korea, often called, but also Germany. Germany now with significantly less than 20,000 active cases. Now, I'm only saying that this is kind of means we are over the hill, but it doesn't mean that this is the end, because, you know, the virologists say if 60% of the population had the infection and are basically out of an active case, then this would be good for the population. Now, I take from these diagrams that there are also other countries, and these are countries where success is much less advanced. You see the UK here, Brazil here, US here, and Russia. This is the very first time that we see a kind of a level of, we don't know whether that's kind of a trend or, but otherwise these countries are countries that have shown constantly rising active cases. So the result of looking at the medical crisis is the crisis is in the medical area far from being over. That's our starting point for the projections. And we think the growth projections have to be consistent with what we know about the medical crisis. So this is the approach we take. Question number one you may remember is, how big is the slump during the shutdown? So what we basically do is we look at the broad breakdown of the economy into 10 sectors and say, how big is the production that's still going on during the shutdown? And you can basically say we have used two variants. Variant A is a more pessimistic scenario, and B is a more optimistic scenario. Agriculture and forestry, we basically say there is hardly any significant effect, although we see the first ones coming up, but at the moment. So manufacturing, so that goes across the board from cars to whatever electronics we have, 50 in a pessimistic scenario, 80. And that's based on surveys. Construction still doing well, as I said, 80, 90%. Trade, transportation, hospitality, that includes the restaurants, by the way, this is 50, 70%. Telecommunication, we basically assume not a significant effect. Some effect, but basically we say 100%. Financial services, 70, 80%. Real estate, housing, there's no turnover, so much turnover in real estate, but housing, that means rents, do people pay rents and so on, that's still going on, so the slump is not too big. Business services, big slump, so the consulting companies and so on. Public services, 100%. That's the interesting thing when you deal with national income accounting. National income accounting incorporates the public sector, the production of goods for the public in terms of their production costs. So when teachers go home, they're still counting 100% into what we call GDP. So in that sense, the public sector, 100%. A little bit going down. Health, that's very different. In some sectors, even more. In some sectors, a decline. Other services, that includes the musicians, the artists, and so on. That's the biggest one. If you take this together and weigh it with how much they contribute to GDP, you get basically to these two numbers that are decisive. Either the shutdown is up to 65%, that would be a slump of 35, or about 22%, 78. So that's the range we think that's realistic. And again, this falls into some areas, some categories that most or some researchers do. So what comes out? If we apply this and we start from the optimistic assumption, we start from 78% roundabout. And then remember, it depends on when is the shutdown ended and how long does it take to get back. So this is then what you get if you combine all these all these possibilities. We have scenario one where we say, okay, if the shutdown really ended, I mean, we have mid-May, ended end of April, if a significant share of the companies could increase their production end of April. And we alternatively look at May, June, July. And how long does it take to go back? 2 months, 4 months, 8 months, 12, or 16 months? Then you can do all kinds of calculations. And I want to point out what is the order of magnitude you get to. You get, if you say this all is very fast, namely the shutdown is already basically over, or this end of this month will be over, or end of next month, and then it takes only 2 or 4 months. Then you get to an order of magnitude 3 to close to 7% that the forecasts of the Ministry of Economic Affairs or the Council of Economic Experts have published. 3 to 6 point some percent. But these assumptions are very, very optimistic. Now you can of course say, could take longer if we assume the shutdown isn't 22%, it's only 10%. But then I would say this assumption is very, very optimistic. So in other words, we think this assumption is very optimistic, and we could say over-optimistic. Maybe more realistic is if we expect that the real real shutdown ends in June or July significantly. Keep that in mind. And then it takes maybe 4-8 months. Maybe if you say later, it will be then takes less. But then you get to numbers that are closer to 10%. And if you think that it may take a much longer period of time, there's a medical crisis over only in a year. So the adjustment will be slowly. People have to wear masks. They can't do certain things. Clubs will be closed and bars will be closed and so on. Then you get easily to numbers that are 2-digit when you look at the decline in GDP. Now, when you assume, let's say, how would then be the monthly developments? And I want to show you this, how that can be shown. So let us think about the monthly economic output. If we say the shutdown ended already 2 weeks and slowly people or companies can adjust. And here you see one graph, one line that is basically the line that was projected, the growth path that was projected over time until December 21. If we start at 0, kind of that is the end of last year, beginning of this year. If we say, well, if the corona crisis had not happened, what would have been the forecast? And the forecast was that Germany would grow at a rate of 1 or 1.5%. Now came the crisis. This is for sure. And again, 22, maybe only 15, but maybe 35%. So in that sense, we have to see, is the subsequent development a fast one or a slow one? If it's very fast, if it's only 2 months, then we get to this one. And if it's 4 months here, 8 months, 12 months, 16 months. All of this, however, means we get back right after this shutdown to only at only 22%. We call this that you see here a V recession, a V, because it reminds us of the letter V. Even this one is a V recession. And the economic costs are basically, if you want to do it mathematically, you would say the area between this line and this. Production and consumption opportunities gone forever, forever. And whatever the government does, compensating people for their loss of income, is basically saying we take it away from these people to give it to them. And the question is how much would that do? But that's not our topic of today. So if we think the shutdown is a little bit longer, then we get to this one. And this is basically saying it's end of June instead of end of April. And this basically the same picture. So this graph's the same, and then takes a little bit longer here. And this is what we call a U recession, because it reminds us of the letter U. Now, the letter U basically means we are sitting longer in the shutdown. Instead of, if you say it would be today, mid-March, mid-April, we already had 60 days or 44 working days, let's say. And the longer it takes, of course, then the bigger is the extent of the crisis or the recession. Now, if you take this a little bit further and say, maybe the shutdown is even more pronounced, then you get to numbers, and I don't want to pick out any, but you get to numbers that are immediately or easily in the 2-digit area. And only if the shutdown has already ended and we basically see the same production levels in 2 months, so that would be end of June, then would be kind of 5.3%. But nobody believes that this is the case. So we can easily go in this direction. So 2-digit. And of course, if you take a very, very pessimistic scenario, so end of July, 16 months, you get even over 20%. Now, let's hope this will not be the case. But from this, we can take that the recession is probably more than we are told or the first estimates suggest. So the summary would be the economic effects in the short run are that it will be much worse than the global financial crisis. Remember, the global financial crisis 2008, 2009 led to a decline in GDP in Germany by somewhat over 5% in 2009, and it was compensated immediately in 2010. but it will presumably not be as bad as the Great Depression in 1930, 1931, where we talked about much higher numbers. So a recession costs production and consumption opportunities. Some sectors, as I said, will be hit very hard. Tourism assumes that 2023 will be the first year where we'll see the pre-corona time structures. Education for some countries, certainly for Germany too, but not to the extent that there's a big financial loss, because education in most of the most institutions in Germany is public. And then we see, of course, durable consumer goods, that they are hit. So it will raise unemployment, of course, and the effects will vary between countries and the structures of the social security net. You all hear that in the US, 30 million and more unemployed people. Here we're not talking, we even don't talk about it. So it's basically, we're now talking about less than 1 percentage point or around 1 percentage point currently a rise in unemployment because of the various social security structures that we have. The policy response will focus on the fiscal side, unlike in the global financial crisis, where monetary policy basically tried to get the economy out of the slump. Germany's easy GDP, that's the summary, can easily go down by 10% or even more in 2020. Once the medical crisis over, and only if that's over, with a relatively strong and fast recovery. But the longer it takes, the longer will be also the more pronounced will be the long-term effects. Let me just say a few words about the long-term effects. And the long-term effects will be huge, huge economic costs. Job destruction is fast. Job creation, we always know, is much more slowly. Border crossings. We live in a Europe, for example, with open borders. That will come, but it will take some time. We'll come back. But what about long distance traveling? Long distance tourists to exotic countries. Where will people be able and will they be willing to do this? Government budget deficit will look like wartime budgets. Wartime budgets basically means expenditure at any cost. Right now, you could say the government doesn't have to pay high interest rates or no interest rates at all, but they will look terrible. The estimates that will come out this week from the German government basically means that the deficit will be about 100 billion euros. And now the question is, what are the long-term effects on the structure of the economy? That's an open question. We can talk about this, but again, just a glimpse of indication. The longer people will realize that the crisis is severe, the more they will change their consumer behavior. And then, of course, we have probably effects on globalization and trade orientation. Germany is very dependent on open borders, on globalization. As you know, 50% of exports accounted for about 50% of German GDP. And then it's easy to say these popular arguments that you hear all over the country. We should produce this and this and this and this on our own. Yeah, these people basically say we should decline our living standards because we know international trade is welfare increasing. Now, of course, strategic things should be produced perhaps at home. And now the definition of what strategic is different. So, having said this, I summarize, going back to the title of my talk, the recession will probably be much stronger than the 3, 5, 6%. I fear that it will be around 10% or more. And as I often say, I hope I'm wrong. I fear I'm right, or we are right in this. Thank you very much for your attention. And now we can open the floor for questions.
Thank you so much, Michael, for sharing your insights. Our participants already asked quite a few questions in the meantime, and of course, you're still welcome to ask questions in the Q&A section. Early in your presentation, you said something about Sweden, and I would like to start with a question in this direction from a participant. What is your opinion on Sweden's way? Some say that they are approaching herd immunity in Stockholm already. So while we face the risk of a second or third wave in fall, they probably won't have that risk. What do you think about that?
Well, I could say I'm the wrong person as an economist to ask this question, but it is certainly something we will look in research for a long time at, because indeed the shutdown in Sweden was much less pronounced. However, the death rates are much higher. Whether that is related to the shutdown or the lack of shutdown, I cannot judge, but it will certainly be one area, one question that we will discuss. Did Sweden do better? And if there is the second and third wave, then how do they get out of this? By the way, this is one aspect also that changes consumer behavior, because people will fear a second and third wave. Even if it doesn't come, it leads to irrational consumer behavior. And that is something we need to take into account. I mean, you all know about the toilet paper. That was irrational. But there can be other irrational things. I hear from a friend here who runs a jewelry store in Koblenz. He has business like on Christmas or before Christmas. People go into these things. Or I hear that real estate guys get questions from people who want to invest in real estate now, kind of the safe haven, maybe they think. So it leads to all kinds of irrational behavior, which could, of course, backfire on the economy once it turns out it was irrational. I see a question here by Stefan Kastner. When is monetary expansion financial or fiscal deficit too much? That gives me the opportunity to say something about the fiscal deficit and the monetary expansion. Right during the global financial crisis, monetary policy was in the driver's seat. They financed basically banks. They helped banks to survive. This was the core of the policy, and fiscal policy did a little bit here and there. You could say the global financial crisis ripped the monetary policy from all their clothes. They are now standing there in their underwear, if I may say so. Now it's the fiscal time. And this will lead to the same on the fiscal side. After the crisis, the fiscal side will be in a huge problem, just like after a war. And forget about any tax reduction plans for the next 10 years. Just forget about it, because it will not happen. Just like monetary policy basically used up all its munition, the fiscal policy will now use up all its munition. And Germany is in the best situation of many, many countries. We started with a surplus of between 1% and 2% of GDP. Countries like the US or China or France start with higher deficits. The US 7%, China 6%, France 4% of GDP. So now, that's an interesting point, Stefan, you raised. Now, the fiscal deficits require financing. Now, you know that the German government decided basically to borrow 126 billion euros. There is no capacity in the market, no liquidity to buy these bonds. So what will they do? I exaggerate a little bit. They will on a Monday morning sell bonds to the Deutsche Bank, and the Deutsche Bank 3 hours later will sell these bonds to the ECB. And the ECB said, we didn't directly finance the governments. We bought the assets in the secondary market. I exaggerate a little bit, but basically the task of the monetary policy right now is to finance the fiscal deficits. When is it too much? That's a good question, if it is too much. But where this is, again, at such an interest rate level, it's easy to finance it. But another issue is, what is the confidence people or market participants will have in the sustainability of the fiscal deficits? Because those have to disappear. And this will lead to drastic measures after the crisis. And people don't talk about it yet now. And of course, this is not the time. But make no mistake, there will be drastic measures necessary after the medical crisis over.
One question from Professor Dufay is, which problem is easier or more difficult to solve, the supply problem or the consumption shortfall?
Once the medical crisis is over, Gunther, I think, again, assuming that the length not too long, demand will come back and then the supply will respond to it. But of course, the longer it takes, the more the supply shock will lead to really abruptions there and will take much longer. So in other words, the answer depends on the length of the recession. If it takes longer and the adjustment is very gradual, then we will see that the supply shock is very, very serious. And then it takes much longer. And again, it will take probably, if the recession lasts for a year or so, will take a multifold of that time to get back to levels, not structures. That these will be different probably, to levels the same. But so that's a good question. But I would say, if the length is not too big of the real deep recession, then consumption can come back. But that also depends on the country. I think, for example, that here in Germany, we are in a relatively good situation. Most workers are compensated to a large extent for their loss in income. If they have to work fewer hours during the week, they get, as you know, compensation, nearly full 80% compensation if you look at the net income. So in that sense, that is different from other countries. Yeah. What is the implication for master graduates in 2020, in 2021, in terms of job market prospects? Yeah, that's a good question. We are wondering about this too. Our career center tells me that jobs may be different ones, and maybe even after the crisis is over. As you know, some companies already announced more home office after the crisis. You may have just heard yesterday or the day before yesterday, Twitter said, we will move many jobs to the homes of our workers. And some people like it, some don't, but there will be a change there. So in other words, the master graduates may look at different types of jobs. It's certainly not the best time. When we go, never a good time to go in the job market when there's a recession, no matter whether it's only demand driven or demand and supply driven. So it's always good to go into the job market when we have a boom, then compared to a slump. But I would say here the answer is probably the better you're qualified, the better are your prospects. So should I look at the questions? Verena, you want to summarize a little bit? You have a better overview?
Let me insert myself with a question from Rolf Langhammer, and he's referring back to Germany being an export-oriented economy. So the question is, if the recovery is asymmetrical across countries, with China and other countries recovering earlier than Germany, would that shift your forecast into a more positive direction?
The answer is no. By the way, I forgot to say, Rolf, basically we assume that there are no major insolvencies. Just the adjustment takes time a little bit when there are more insolvencies. But your point, China, people sometimes say China may pull out the other countries out of the recession because China recuperates, then first Asia, and then they buy a lot of goods here. I am not sure whether this is a significant effect. And I'll tell you why. A recent study showed that during the past three crises, so that was 1997, the Asian crisis, 2001, the dot-com bubble, and the global financial crisis, China's upswing was preceded by an upswing in the Western countries. And in the last crisis, China used a lot of fiscal programs to stimulate the economy. So the indebtedness of the government even is now very high, let alone the private sector or public enterprise sector, I should better say, or include. So I'm not convinced that China will lead the way out of the recession. I could imagine that partly maybe, but the dominant role will be played by the fiscal stimulus in Western countries. And I have to say, you address one right point, that Germany, we always think about ourselves. The German recovery will be impeded by the slower response in other countries. I mean, we have to keep in mind 50% of our exports go into the EU, and we are probably one of the faster countries that recuperate, Austria included. So, but Spain, Italy, France will probably be more slowly. So in other words, not only how fast can we kind of start the production in, but how fast would be the demand from these other countries. So when we talk about disruption of supply chains, we always think about, can they kind of supply us with enough intermediate goods? But the question should include, are they demanding as many intermediate goods that we produce for their production? And so the asymmetry will affect us too on the demand side, I think. Back to you, Rebecca.
Another question is, if the recession is much more drastic than currently projected by the various institutions you mentioned, what economic stimuli should be used best by governments?
Yeah.
And do you think these stimuli can lead to additional negative effects, such as higher taxes and, again, lower consumption?
That basically can be translated into the question, is it enough what the government is doing? And the answer is, it depends. So if it is really going far down and it lasts longer, then what the government decides in Germany will definitely not be enough. You hear all kinds of anecdotal evidence where some entrepreneurs say, we can live for another 2 months or 3 months, or little shop owners, they say, well, we are liquidity constrained, so what we get from the government is basically helping us for 2 or 3 months. A friend of mine runs a bus company, and he says, when do the bus tours again start? Probably not before versus the end of the year. I don't take any money from the government because that's on a loan basis and I have to fulfill all kinds of things, and that's so much bureaucracy involved. So, I mean, that's probably not the typical case, but there will be problems for companies that say, okay, what I get in terms of help can keep me alive for 2 or 3 months. So if it lasts longer, there will be additional stimuli packages necessary in Germany. I'm absolutely sure about that. And you will see the writing on the wall very soon.
So are you then expecting a severe inflation to come soon or midterm, and at the same time governmental debt cuts within the Eurozone?
I don't think that inflation is on the horizon, because I think the demand decline is very severe. But the longer it takes, and that's the question that relates again back to the question of Gunter Dufay, if we have really a shock on the supply side, meaning basically capacity drops off, then there could be indeed inflationary effects. We see a little bit in the food sector right now. I mean, in the US, where you are much more so, where we see negative supply effects already into a more serious extent than here. But I do not see this across the board.
And one participant asked whether you could share your thoughts about the relationship of lockdown and welfare of society.
Yeah, that's very easy. And I can go back to this. I'm sorry. Let me just go back to this diagram, the U-shaped or V-shaped. So keep in mind, the longer it takes, the more pronounced is the U, and maybe it's goes like a W and before it goes up. The welfare is basically, the welfare loss is this area. That's basically income lost. And when people get compensated, as I said, they only get it from somebody else, those who pay for it. And this may look like the government should pay us. The government has no income. They can borrow, and they can basically look at an intertemporal redistribution from future taxpayers to today. And there we have to be very careful. The recent decisions on, for example, a German pension fund means a huge burden on the young generation. And now we put another burden on them. And again, I'm not saying young in terms of those who go to school, but the next 10 years, 20 years that have to pay for this. So the longer it lasts, the more pronounced will be the welfare loss, but it will be significant. And then, of course, you could speculate about the political effects. People will have certain political views if the slump is too big. Okay. I may have time for one or two more questions. I have to.
Yeah, so I should suggest I read one question and then my colleague Verena finishes off with the last question. So what my question is, or it's actually someone else's question, but I'm reading it to you. Yeah. So this participant is wondering if you could talk a little bit about investment. It is positive that construction in Germany has been mildly affected. You were talking about that in the very beginning of your presentation. And maybe consumption is affected more relative to investments than in a classic recession. But how do you see business investment evolving under so much uncertainty?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. It's an excellent question. I see the effect on business investment as a function of the time, the length of the slump. So the length of the recession will determine how fast uncertainty disappears. The longer it takes, the more hesitant will companies become to invest in the, let's say, upgrading of their capital stock or even expansion of the capital stock. I mean, expansion would be out then anyway. But that will really depend on the length and the depth, of course, of the recession. Now, this may be a too general answer because I cannot give you numbers, but we see the effect on consumption right now, and investment will be indeed a function of the length of the recession. You see that some companies already say we prepare for the time after Corona. But then they have a certain time horizon in mind, and probably they will revise this because they base it on the economic forecasts that are on the table right now, that are, we think, very, very optimistic and over-optimistic. I can only repeat. But everybody is free to form its own opinion. When I go through the street, that's anecdotal evidence. And I remember how it was in the global financial crisis. There's no comparison. There's no comparison. Now, the global financial crisis was more or less a demand shock and a little bit on the supply side, the banks, but nothing like this. A universal shutdown. We've never had this. It's unprecedented for 90 years. Okay, so investment will go down, but how much is difficult to say now.
Based on that, I would ask the last question, as unfortunately time is running up fast. Do you think this shutdown was really necessary, given also the decline in GDP?
I don't want to weigh economic effects against human lives, and I cannot say whether this has saved human lives. I cannot say. We will see this in hindsight. If virologists, if medical doctors cannot say, I'm the wrong person for this question, and probably I would say no one can say it really honestly. We'll see perhaps in 2 years when we study the Swedish example, maybe a little bit the Dutch example, and then the German example, and then we'll know. But it is very difficult. I can only say if I were a politician, I would feel that a more strict policy is easier to defend than a too lax policy. So I think the Swedish government was extremely bold to do this, to say we don't shut down the economy, but they can do it with people who basically listen to good arguments. So the Swedish population basically practices social distancing and so on. But it is really difficult to say whether it's necessary, but I can imagine why politicians lean more towards more restrictions than when you don't have the responsibility. Because you always say, if it's too long, at least we haven't, we have saved lives, so maybe a few more. But if we open up too early or if we don't shut down and it leads to a lot of deaths, we will be responsible for so many deaths. So the more restrictive policy is, as we would say in game theory, the dominant strategy.
Once again, thank you so much, Michael, for sharing your insights. And dear participants, thank you for tuning in. Maybe we see each other in the next webinar on Monday, May 18. Michael, maybe you want to say some final words to the participants.
Well, there's one basically message that I always remember when it comes to talking and giving talks. The famous survey that people have done many times after the 15-minute news broadcasted, they say, what do you remember? And people don't remember more than one or two things. And they remember the best always, across the board, the weather, because that came last. So I hope that you remember at least one thing and that you can basically carry through the next month or in your memory, you memorize, will the recession be more 3 to 6% or will it be more significant? And I'm ready to be beaten up if it's only 3%, because then I'm happy and celebrate with you. But again, if that's not so, one thing keep in mind, it could easily go deeper, although we don't like it. Thank you for listening. Thank you for tuning in. And I hope one or the other I can talk to also in other occasions. Thank you, Stefan and Gunther, that you tuned in, and many others who may have done this here for the first time today. Okay, so I would say goodbye and see you hopefully in person sometime, somewhere soon.